So tomorrow morning, we're going to get a review of many different kinds of sound therapies that are available, and that will be exciting to hear all the differences and all the approaches that are now being used. I'm just going to provide a brief overview of some of the challenges here and the way that we think about this. So, in terms of the neurophysiological models of tinnitus, tinnitus has to be a result of changes in the spontaneous activity, and we can reduce the prominence of this spontaneous activity by adding some noise. Pretty straightforward. So this is an example that we give to the patients with some preliminary explanations, but one type of tinnitus might be a periodic tinnitus, a tonal tinnitus, and somewhere in the system it might be represented by these periodic action potentials on some nerve somewhere. However, if you put in a low-level noise, the representation of those of the activity would be quite random. If you add the two together, the periodicity created by the tinnitus will no longer stand out. So this is a simple explanation, but is often helpful to get patients in line with why, in fact, having some low-level noise might break up the perception of their tinnitus. So you can think about this psychological mechanisms. If you have a background sound going on, it can be distracting, it can compete with the tinnitus, and can also decrease the prominence. Also, if this background noise is continuous and not changing, then you can habituate to it. And maybe that will help you habituate to your tinnitus as well if it's steady state and unimportant. So we try and decrease the prominence, both for thoughts and emotions, for sleep and for concentration. So some people might use a background noise if they're working in an office on their own, or they're working in an office and they can use a wearable device when reading. Generally speaking, broadband noise is much easier to listen to than a very narrow band of noise or tones. So quite often over the years, people have come up with very clever ways of using narrow bands of noise focused on the tinnitus pitch match frequency, but these narrow bands of noise are often as annoying as the tinnitus is itself. Jack Vernon developed the first wearable devices for patients after some patient took him, I think I have it in here, some patient actually took him to a fountain in Portland, Oregon, and showed this was where the masking was no longer disturbing. Jack usually suggested total masking, but he also indicated that the patient should decide that the actual level used was not disturbing also. The sound therapies differ in their level, in the quality, and the philosophy behind how the sound therapies are used, whether you're trying to change the tinnitus or the reaction to the tinnitus. In some situations, people go onto the mechanisms involved in the sound therapy. That may or may not be critical for the actual clinical application, but some of those are line busy masking, or some of them might be brain remapping and so on. There's lots of wearable devices these days, and of course everything is available on your little computer in your pocket or purse, which is also known as a phone. And these are now being used for all kinds of applications to stream up to your hearing aid, your cochlear implant, or your tinnitus sound generator, and combining with those. So we're in a time where everything is changing in the electronic field. Everything electronic can be connected together, and it's what's happening. The theories of sound therapy vary substantially in the level of background sound used. So I mentioned that Jack Vernon started off with total masking, where the tinnitus is completely covered, and the person actually hears their masking noise instead of their tinnitus. And in our experience, in some situations, that's just fine. Some patients prefer to hear shh than the whine of their tinnitus. Not everybody, but some do. It's also possible to use partial masking, where the person still hears their tinnitus, but now hears this background sound. And the advantage of that is that the tinnitus may no longer be as loud as it was. This is called partial masking. Or it can also reduce the prominence of the tinnitus, and therefore be less obtrusive than the tinnitus on its own. So when I first started getting involved in this, again when I was about 12 years old, it was really important that we worried about making the tinnitus worse by having noise in there, and also creating, perhaps these people were more susceptible to noise-induced hearing loss and noise-induced tinnitus. And so we were really focused on using a low-level noise. And so we suggested that they, both the noise and the tinnitus be heard, but try and reduce the loudness of the tinnitus. Ross Coles, who I worked with and was instrumental in getting me involved and interested in tinnitus, was also thought about this. I worked with him in the same laboratory in the United Kingdom, and he was talking about using this where it's equal, the two are equal of loudness. Jonathan Hazel then suggested just audible through the masking noise, and Jastroboff later came along and named this the mixing point, where the patient perceives the tinnitus sound and the external sound start to mix or blend together. So this is a figure from this tinnitus retraining therapy. This is the intensity of the noise, and this is the effectiveness of habituation, where you just hear the noise. According to Jastroboff, the effectiveness got greater until you got to the mixing point, and then at higher levels that this was no longer, it became less effective until the tinnitus was completely masked, and then it was not effective at all. And we have shown, and others have shown, that that's simply not true. The mixing point is too loud for most patients. It should not be a goal, in our opinion, for partial masking, and we suggested that you use the lowest level that is effective for patients. So an example of this is have the level of the signal on the spectrum. This is a tinnitus. This is total masking. This is partial masking, where the masker level is lower. An example from a friend, Grant Searchfield from New Zealand. You hear a cricket sound, that's your tinnitus. You play some waterfalls in the background so that you don't hear your tinnitus anymore, but maybe you didn't notice that you still heard your tinnitus all the time. It was still there. So that's the visual analogy of partial masking. Lots of sound therapies available: broadband noise, modulated noise, combinated tones, music, specially processed music, spectrally adjusted sounds, notched noise, notched music, lots of options, and we're going to hear more about those tomorrow. Many different sound therapy options. They differ in the sound used and the level recommended. Many patients find these helpful, although not recommended by some reviews. I think I know that some patients find these helpful. A lot of patients spend their own money on these devices, and we have no problems recommending and using them for lots of patients. The individual patients have different preferences, and that's important to keep in mind clinically as well.